Good morning. I want to talk today about law, really, and it's in a week when the UK government is in deep trouble because it wants to go back on a Brexit agreement, and it's all in the papers and on the television, isn't it, that they're breaking international law. But what it turns out is really it's the way that law is likely to be interpreted by the other European nations. Hardly surprising that that should be the case, because they are going to interpret things pretty literally. They don't want us to leave. I didn't want us to leave, but then that's my opinion, and it was overruled. But the thing is that law is not just law. It can be interpreted very strictly, and it can be interpreted in a broader sense. And what I want to talk about today, after a few weeks of saying things about the Old Testament, is looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, and in chapter 5 onwards, where he's talking about we've got the Beatitudes, and he's talking about salt and light, the law and the prophets. I mean, just look at a few of the titles here in my Bible: concerning anger, concerning oaths, concerning retaliation, love for enemies, concerning adultery, and so on. And he is talking about law here, but he's also talking about the abuse of law by people who wanted to have power over other people. Instead of the law being something that was God-given through Moses and something that was wonderful and a gift from God, it had become something that the priests and the leaders and the more conservative Jews were using to enslave people with. They were trying to trap people. So people had to, make sacrifices and give money to the temple and somehow buy their souls. Very like the pre-Reformation arguments of indulgences to finance the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome. But I digress. And what Jesus is doing, he's talking here about law. He's talking about how we should be with each other, which is what the original law was about. And he talks about retaliation. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to use you and take your coat, sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. Now clearly, we would not obey those, literally, those sorts of laws, because if we did, we would just be walked over all day long. And Jesus is pointing out when he says these things how ridiculous it is that his fellow Jews were enslaving others by a very literal interpretation of law that put a burden and a demand on them that disabled their lives, really. They were enslaved to the temple. But there are parallels today. And dare I say it, there are parallels even within the Christian church. Now I know people are going to say, oh, this is dodgy. But I tell you, I've been in and out of the church all my life. And the times when I felt least comfortable in the church has been when I have been with groups who would have described themselves as evangelicals. And that's because they would pick up with a very literal interpretation of the Bible. So, for instance, the whole issue about human sexuality and equality of human rights between men and women and so on, would often be distorted by their interpretation of the Bible. They would interpret the story of Genesis, a creation story, absolutely literally, and so on. And say, well, dinosaurs, no, that's all fiction, that's rubbish. And, we have to actually look upon the Bible and what it says in the light of the context in which it was written, all the way through. And it's written through a lot of different ages, with a lot of different levels of human understanding. And so it's very obvious that it's very important how we interpret law, whether it be secular civil law or the Mosaic law, the Jewish law, or whether it be international law in terms of an international trade agreement. And it's only when you interpret law reliably that you will be trusted by other people, and that is absolutely what some of our former prime ministers are saying now. But I want to go back to the thing about what our duty as Christians is, because in knowing our Bible is really important. I don't know it as well as I should, and I never have done, and I probably never will. But I think the Bible is important, extremely important, a valuable document, a valuable library. But we have to be careful with it and not abuse it, because it's a beautiful thing that is given to us. It is a gift from God. And the various councils that have put together the Bible as it is given to us today over the years, they did it prayerfully, and we have to rely upon them and trust them that they made the right decisions. And I think they did. It evolved. The book of James only got in there by the skin of its teeth, but it's one of my favourite books. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that another time. But the thing with interpreting the Bible is that sometimes I've known Christians over the years who have used their intense knowledge of the Bible and their strict interpretation of it in order to have power over other people. And I think that's incredibly sad that might happen. Because it has always, in my experience, been done with the best of intentions. People wanted to draw people to Jesus. They wanted to draw people to know him. Well, I don't think that, and I want this to be our thought for the day, that we get to know Jesus anywhere better than in Matthew chapter 5. Looking at the way that he makes, in some ways, quite absurd statements that really aren't going to work in practice, but are clearly not supposed to be taken absolutely literally. My father was a conscientious objector in the Second World War. As it turned out, he was a fireman working in London and Crewe, and in Scotland he was in a lot of danger a lot of the time. But he would refuse. He always went to prison because he was an accountant in the civil service, and the court that he went to said, right, you go work for in the army, in the pay corps. And he refused. He said, I'm not having anything to do with the army. But the reason he did not want anything to do with the armed forces was because, as a Christian, he believed that we should not kill. And we know that's wrong. But we also know that in this 75 years, and I'm sure some of you saw that interview with Captain Tom the other night, we can see the calibre of the people who did go out, do very brave things. And yes, they did kill people. But as Captain Tom says, war doesn't achieve anything. But sometimes it just has to happen because things boil over. whole thing about the law, if we go right back just to the basis of it all with the Ten Commandments, it's all about theft. It's about stealing things from other people, their lives, their pride, their ways of thinking. And that's what we can do when we try to coerce and brainwash and just make a very conservative, literal, simplistic interpretation of what we have here in this fantastic book. Amen.